Welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Ralitsa Hiteva and I'm a research fellow at SPRU. In a way, I'm the guilty party. I'm responsible for organizing this event. Before I start talking about this, I wanted to say that I'm extremely grateful to the British Academy for the award they gave me in trying to start a conversation within the research community and a bit more widely about what type of methods we use when we research infrastructure and who exactly do we bring along with us when we do so. So these introductory slides are really a very informal way in which I wanted to present really the idea behind the workshop, and they are mainly reflections on things that I've seen in the field, so to speak, working with different types of stakeholders on infrastructure governance over the past maybe 11 to 13 years. I know I don't look it, but it's been that long. So one of the reasons why I became interested in methods and infrastructure research is because it seems that although there is an increased focus on policy with regards to infrastructure, the value that it delivers, who it delivers value to, and public engagement with it, there seemed to me that there is a disconnection, an essential disconnection which occurs at several different points in the way in which we imagine infrastructure research takes place, in the way in which we kind of design our research projects where we examine real cases of failure of infrastructure services or studying how assets really impact people's lives and any kind of policy objectives that we have. And I don't claim that these are all the important gaps. There are many of them. But I would say that in my experience, two gaps are really worth a look. And an institutional gap in infrastructure is a well-known but little spoken of. When we talk about gaps, we usually focus on the investment gap in infrastructure. And that is, where would the money come from in order to fund the investment in infrastructure? And the assumption, the underlying assumption tends to be that if we invest more in infrastructure, then it's quite likely that we're going to get more benefits of infrastructure. The institutional gap, however, means that there is little opportunity for people to engage with decision-making about infrastructure. The lower you go down in the kind of the political levels of infrastructure decision-making. So biggest opportunity for bringing in opinions tend to be at local planning level, or if there is local opposition to a specific type of infrastructure project. But if you think about how often and how effectively people are actually asked, and not only people, but even non-governmental organizations, industry are a bit lucky in this respect. They're asked a bit more frequently about what type of infrastructure investment do you need and what type of projects are you looking for. There is really not a lot of opportunities to express opinions. So the institutional gap means that basically people don't participate very effectively in decision-making about infrastructure, and definitely don't participate the lower you go down in the supply chain. The value gap in infrastructure, I would say that this is the failure of infrastructure investment to actually bring about values to all participants in society. It's expressed very strongly regionally, as we have seen many times, with areas which are well-to-do, areas such as London and Greater Manchester, for example, that have better opportunities of benefiting from value from infrastructure investment, while other areas are struggling to do so. There was a report in 2015 which created quite a lot of discussion in infrastructure kind of in infrastructure policy and people that work on infrastructure. It was by the Green Alliance, and they highlighted several things that are quite important as a starting point to think about this. They talked about public engagement being critical to finding common ground between different stakeholders and making infrastructure delivery successful in the UK. So they called for people having more opportunity and direct opportunities to actually define what their infrastructure needs are. And the mechanisms that they saw this happening through is local infrastructure dialogues. And I have to say that at the time when this report was published, that was caused quite a stir. It was a quite progressive idea. But if you think about it, simply, it is not. It makes absolute sense. In a way, the gap that I got really interested in is how methods turn into evidence which supports decision-making that happens at particular scales and levels, and how, in a way, that creates a disconnection or a connection with the value that's produced from infrastructure investments. So my premise is a very simple one. My assumption is that the methods that we use when we're researching infrastructure shape who actually we are able to involve through our research, what kind of interests and ideas we can represent and include and engage with, in a way that helps us that shapes the way we see infrastructure problems and the possible solutions, and how ultimately we engage with policymaking processes. And I think of it as how far actually our ideas about infrastructure issues and the possible solutions can travel in the real world. What the Green Alliance pointed out is that multi-stakeholder engagement is critical for creating value from infrastructure delivery and research. My claim here is that the other thing that really matters is how engagement actually takes place and when. And I think that public engagement with infrastructure in research context should happen very early on. My argument that I make here, and I would like to test today, with your help, is that it should start with the methods that we design in order to engage. So far, there are very few cases of infrastructure research which involve non-academic actors in methods design. And they tend to be focused either on developing countries, and they tend to be developing studies, or they tend to be about when something really goes wrong with infrastructure. One example is that there were a couple of studies that I was able to find, and they were all recent ones. They're all related to Flint and the water crisis in the US. And that was linked to the fact that citizens, people that lived in Flint at this point, there was such a breakdown of trust that the only way they would allow for someone to do research on this particular issue is by creating this long process of creating a certain level of intimacy between what will be the people that will be studied, which in effect also changed the way in which the methods were designed in order to study that particular area. So my question here is, how do we nurture dialogue with non-academic actors in infrastructure research? And the reason why I think we need to engage specifically with non-academic actors is because quite often the breakdown in value is not only linked to people, citizens or users of particular service, but I think the way in which we work with industry, the way in which we'd work with non-government organizations, with local authorities, or even branches of government, they are in a very limited way. And usually what tends to happen is that there is a general preference and a long history of technical methods which are being used in order to engage with these different stakeholders. So when I looked into infrastructure methods gap, this is something I came up with, I found out that most of the critical evaluations of the methods for infrastructure research that we're using in the context of assessments of the impact of infrastructure projects. And there is very little critical discussion about the methods that we use actually to research infrastructure. And there seem to be very few cases that try to trace how the methods that we use in doing research on infrastructure actually shape or impact the way in which we engage with non-academic stakeholders, and then trying to think through to what extent it actually adds value to the benefits that we can see from putting forward certain infrastructure solutions or proposing ways in which to see infrastructure problems. So there is also there seems to be an almost linear link between need and how infrastructure need is assessed, and how it's fed into a evidence-built process of decision-making at national level. It seems that technical studies and technical methods are preferred because they're seen as more scientific. However, that creates serious issues with how then they're being translated to the potential users, and that is different branches of government. I have been part of several quite large multidisciplinary research projects and consortiums that have tried to, with different degrees of success, to bring the technical and non-technical methods together in order to create more opportunities for national level government to actually engage with the findings that are being produced. And it's very difficult process, and what we see most of the time is that there is such a reduction of the actual findings in the process of translation that I would question the extent to which these findings are still valid, and they actually are the type of findings that the intended audience can actually work with. I don't want to name projects, but I would say that I have watched several modelers trying to teach national level government people to learn how to use particular program so they can do modeling for themselves and understand what the models produce as results, and has been most unsatisfactory on both ends. So when I was thinking about, so what do we do then? How do we change this? And I thought to myself that perhaps the way we look at methods is very, very limited. When we pick methods to study, methods for our infrastructure research, we tend to go to where we feel safe, something we know how to do, we've done it before. But I thought to myself that maybe this is the wrong way to approach it, because we shouldn't really be looking for a place of safety, we should be looking for something else. And what I'm proposing is that we think of methods as dialogues, and dialogues with the different kind of stakeholders that we're going to engage with as part of any kind of research project. And I would suggest that this dialogue is actually built on three principles. One is reciprocity, reflection, and cooperation. So reciprocity and the concept of dialogue implies that you have multiple interactions. And reciprocity implies that there is almost an equal weight that you give to non-academic and academic experiences, interests, and ideas. And that it happens more than once. You don't just set it in the beginning and then run with it. You give an opportunity to actually reflect for both sides or the different parties, and then to change it. Cooperation. I think I would say that what methods can do in terms of open up opportunities for engagement and change the type of value that we get from infrastructure research really depends on how we engage with methods. And I'll say that if we think of methods as dialogues, there is an opportunity to cooperate with non-academic actors, be it national level government, local authorities, industry, non-government organizations, users, There's more and more studies directly interacting with users. I would say that it would suggest that, in a way, it will offer us an opportunity to cooperate with them in a very different way. And the reason why I'm really taken with the idea of dialogue is because it's in such a stark contrast with the kind of the very regimented way in which we think about methods as something that is predetermined usually at the point at which we write project proposals. Sometimes it's revisited in terms of have there been any big changes on the ground. For example, if you want to hold big focus groups and workshops and coronavirus is happening, you can no longer do that and you have to find a different method of engagement. So my suggestion is that we think of it in a different way. Right, so how do I do this? My challenge is that I want to, with what we're doing today, I want to ask two questions, and that is what kind of methods we can use to help open up participation, not only in decision making, but also in terms of building partnerships and joined up thinking. And these are two elements that we don't see considered very often when we choose methods about the infrastructure research that we do. And to do that, today, with help and support from our two non-academic partners, we are going to attempt to do exactly that. As you know, we're going to look at two specific cases. One with Julian O'Kelly from the British Parking Association, who is asking a question, how to build up partnerships and joined up thinking across a diverse set of stakeholders towards enabling mobility as a service, and Kirsten Firth from the Brighton and Hove City Council, who is asking a question, how do we build strong and sustainable partnerships with the private and public sectors to improve the energy performance of buildings and transition heating away from gas? So I would say that these kind of questions are a bit uncomfortable. That these kind of questions are not the kind of questions that we usually start to think about what research projects are going to look like. But these are the kind of questions that really matter to non-academic partners. So what we're trying to do today is to attempt to reverse the process a little bit and start with what do we want to achieve and what do non-academic partners need from us in order for our research to add value to their work. To do this, we're going to hear interventions from Andy Sterling and Benjamin Sovacool, which I'm hoping are going to add some gravitas to my claims and challenge. Thank you, guys. And then we're going to hear introductions from our non-academic stakeholders. And the idea is that we do something very simple. And that is we think about what kind of methods do we usually use in order to think about mobility and energy demand and heating. And then think about what kind of methods are we going to use if we forget, in a way, what we usually use, but we focus on these two elements, which are joined-up thinking and sustainable partnerships. And as you can see, we're separated in two different parts of the room. This one is going to be the area for discussion around energy efficiency and heating, and this one is going to be about mobility as a service. So I want this to be very informal and, in a way, safe space to experiment. So I would say that be as bold and creative as you wish to be. And I'm hoping that Kirsten and Julian are going to rein us in terms of what is practically possible within the scope of their work.